Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple more people coming in, it seems, but as Stephanie said, I just came back from Ningbo, where the SOM 1 was held. I had a chance also after that to stop by in Beijing and met with a number of my people from the foreign ministry as well as people from the commerce, where we sort of discussed a little bit more the agenda for the year in APEC as well as other things. So let me just quickly, I was trying to figure out a little bit more of what you think would be useful for your reporting. And in terms of what came out of SOM 1, I thought it was a very, very useful meeting. We met there. Essentially, SOM 1 was the last 2 days in February, the 27th, 28th. But there were a whole series of about 2 weeks of meetings on different working groups and so on across all of the topics that APEC is involved with. So the last 2 days were the actual SOM meetings. And I think maybe the best thing to say is that it was very clear at the SOM meeting that the Chinese host are very interested this year in trying to come up with a vision for FTAP, the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific. And as you know, this idea or concept had been enunciated in the past, initially I think by the U.S. in 2006, afterwards in Japan in 2010, and of course last year the leaders essentially instructed the senior officials to begin an intellectual discussion, policy discussion of where FTAP will lead, or how do we get to FTAP. So I think this year the Chinese would like to start the process in Beijing at the end of the year. And what I can report on that front is that the United States and China co-sponsored a paper on FTAP. And essentially this paper was tabled at the CTI, which is the Committee on Trade and Investment, and it formed a Friends of the Chair for the CTI. Friends of the Chair simply means that all the APEC economies can get together to provide some advice to the chairman of the CTI, the committee, and that this advice would eventually go up to the senior officials level and essentially advise the ministers and the leaders on the next steps to take to try to realize a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So, so I think the Friends of the Chair has now been formed and was formed in SOM 1 in Ningbo, and they were now working together, again led by the Chinese and the Americans, but also supported by a lot of the others, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, etc., all the other economies. And their job now is to start working on trying to sort of discuss and understand what an FTAP could be, and then make recommendations to the senior officials and then afterwards to the leaders by November this year, November 10th and 11th, as you know. So that, I think, was one of the key points, because this, I think, showed that China and the United States and others were all working together to try to realize this primary focus of the Chinese with regard to APEC this year. Okay. Apart from that, I think the other key, maybe more newsworthy item would be the fact that a number of economies, Japan, China to some extent, but Japan and the United States and Australia co-sponsored some papers that were not tabled actually at the SOM level, but were tabled again at the committee level to try to expand APEC into the services. In other words, as you know, we had done a lot of a few things on IT goods as well as more recently on environmental goods. And there was a feeling that we ought to now focus a little bit more, especially as tariffs themselves are dropping on average in the region, that we ought to focus a little bit more on trying to open up the services market so that basically countries or economies would be more open to having foreign companies and so on, technology or others, come into their market to do services. And so the specific papers that were tabled were in the areas of environmental services, for example, because we already have an environmental goods agreement. And the question then is, what if the different companies wanted to come into different countries or economies to try to provide services in environmental areas to try to improve this or that? So a paper was tabled, again, at the committee level, exchanged on trying to open up the environmental services market. The other one was manufacturing-related services. As you know, there are a lot of investments in different economies that are manufacturing-oriented, building factories and whatever else, but there are a lot of what we call services that are associated with that, meaning even building the factory could be a service, or the technology provided, or the maintenance after you finish your goods and you produce your goods in a country, maintaining it in some form would all be sort of manufacturing-related services. So I think this is an important area for APEC to go into because it's expanding beyond goods into services. And I think more and more, as you know, for example, in the case of the United States, some 70 to 80% of our GDP is actually in services, not in goods. And the more developed economies all have the same pattern where, again, 70 to 80% or more are actually services market rather than goods market. For China, it's still not as high up, but for the more you develop, the higher the percentage goes in terms of services. So a lot of interest in this. And so those, I think, were the two main areas that that I think are newsworthy in terms of what happened in Ningbo. The other thing is there was a call in Ningbo for sort of support. And interestingly, this was a Chinese proposal to try to encourage APEC economies to call for the expansion of the ITA, the Information Technology Agreement, in terms of products coverage. As you know, WTO is working on this issue, trying to expand the ITA coverage in terms of products, and so far have not succeeded. And so the Chinese and everyone else, I think we're planning, hopefully in May and perhaps in the course of the year, to either either issue various statements encouraging APEC economies to support ITA expansion, or in fact, if we can, the best thing is to actually be able to complete the ITA expansion sometime this year, which would again include hundreds and hundreds of more of new products that are going to be included in the agreement that would allow the tariffs for these products to be dropped sharply. And we're hoping in discussion with the Chinese and others that this expansion could occur this year. So we don't need to actually call for the expansion, but actually acknowledge that the expansion has occurred this year. So I think that would be a very important thing. And there's a lot of discussion about this in Psalm 1 on this issue. I think most of you already know that in terms of the APEC structure for this year, in terms of the themes, the Chinese had divided into three themes. The first theme was the regional economic integration. And so a lot of the things I've just discussed fall under that category, including discussion of FTAP, services, and of course a lot of the work we're doing in facilitation, trade facilitation. The second category is a more general one called sort of promoting innovation, economic reforms and growth, and so on. And in that area, the Chinese actually provided about a dozen papers or proposals where they would hope that we would consider in the course of the year. A lot of it really, I think, pertaining to how we, as a whole, in terms of our economies, sustain economic growth. So a lot of them were in the areas of green development, oceans, urbanization, forest coverage, and we also proposed quite a few other areas, and I'll talk about this in more detail a little bit later. But the Chinese had actually tabled 3 papers at the SOM level on urbanization. That is, discussion of urbanization, holding a conference in Tianjin, I think sometime in May. I'm not sure, but I forget the exact date now. But where we would all try to deal with the issue, bring in experts, deal with the issue of urbanization, and how, especially as China is trying to urbanize more rapidly, and Asia is, how we promote more efficient cities, cleaner cities, how we manage population flow, how we design cities, things of that nature that would be helpful to a lot of the APEC economies that are rapidly urbanizing. Again, the other areas are all in the areas of trying to sustain growth. Our own priorities in terms of this particular area have to do with energy security and clean environment. So we, for example, this year we're hoping to be able to announce between the U.S. and China, we're hoping to be able to announce that our 2 countries are going to be doing or conducting fossil fuel subsidies peer reviews. And what that is essentially, for those of you who may or may not know, essentially it's volunteering to have experts come into your economy to study the extent to which your fiscal policies and other policies actually subsidizes the use of fossil fuel, either consumption or production of fossil fuels. So coal and oil and all that. And the idea of doing this is simply because a lot of countries actually do subsidize fossil fuel. And when you subsidize fossil fuel, of course, on one hand, you are, I guess, encouraging the production of and the use of fossil fuels, which, of course, oftentimes are pollutants, although you can have clean coal as well, but most of the time it's not that clean. And so by subsidizing it, also you're sort of lowering the price of fossil fuel, which makes the renewable fuels, the clean fuels, which are newer and maybe technologically more advanced, makes it even more expensive than they actually are. So the idea is that if you were to lower fossil fuel subsidies, then you will also make it more market-oriented and allow renewable fuels to compete against them. So the whole idea is to try to improve the environment and at the same time as taking care of energy security. So we're hoping that this year the U.S. and China can announce that we're both going to be undertaking these reviews. New Zealand and Peru already did last year in Bali, and we're hoping that a few other economies can also join us in doing this so that we have a broader number of countries who would be willing to do these peer reviews. And I think, again, from the environmental point of view, I think it's very important. And of course, a lot of us are now, including Secretary Kerry, very much focused on encouraging international efforts and regional efforts to address climate change. And so this is part of that effort. And we hope that we were considering the possibility that by the end of the year, we could also do a few more things in support of the UN's effort to address climate change issues. And also in this area, at least for the United States, we're also very interested in promoting other things. For example, one of the key priorities for the U.S. is in anti-corruption. And we think that to sustain development in a fair way, as well as in a more predictable way, in a more transparent way, we need to have the APEC economies take more action to try to fight corruption, bribery, money laundering, and so on. So we hope this year to be able to make this a very important area within APEC and work with the Chinese, work with all the other economies to highlight the issue and the problems of corruption and bribery, and to try to come together with a statement of principles and commitments on how we can fight against bribery and as a whole. And also, last year we, in Bali, established for the first time what we call the ACT network, which is, ACT means the Anti-Corruption and Transparency Working Group, essentially. They, for the first time, established this network of law enforcement officials that are committed to working with each other within APEC to cooperate on cross-border cases, to work on training, capacity building, to try to essentially cooperate and increase our capability to fight corruption and bribery. So we're hoping this would be a key part of the APEC agenda. And in fact, the Ministry of Supervision, Minister of Supervision and others actually went to Ningbo and attended the workshop in the days prior to the SAM, showing how China really does, in this case, want to focus on this problem within China, which, of course, as you know, President Xi, since he took office, has been quite focused on with former Vice Premier Wang Qishan and others to work on this problem. So we're hoping this year to use APEC to expand this effort, not just within China or within any individual economy, but across the economies. And similarly in this area, I'll leave time for questions, so don't worry. And within this area, we're also very much focused on continuing what former Secretary Clinton did in 2011 in our year, which is to highlight the importance of women empowerment, women in the economy. So we're proposing, for example, in some of our papers to create, for example, a women's entrepreneurs network around the APEC economies where the women organizations can get together, communicate on ways on how to promote women in the economy, promote women's access to finance, to promote women's roles in management levels. And because we all know not only is this important in terms of from the moral perspective and from the inclusiveness perspective, but this is also important because of because, for example, in the case of Japan, the aging society requiring more and more the utilization of the women in these societies to contribute to the growth of the economy. And I think this works across the board for most of the Asian economies as well. And so that's one area. And the last thing is, I would say, just to have some room for time for questions, the last category is what the Chinese called comprehensive connectivity, which is how do we bring APEC economies closer together in various ways, through physical infrastructure, transportation, or through people-to-people. For example, more travel facilitation, more educational exchanges, things of that nature, to bring APEC economies more into a community. And in that regard, we have quite a number of really good proposals from my point of view on trying to improve or increase private sector investment in physical infrastructure. So the Australians are taking the lead on this. They've already set up a pilot center in Jakarta, and this pilot center essentially is a center that would advise the governments on how to attract private sector investment into infrastructure, meaning you have to change certain regulations, you have to make things more transparent, you have to make the investment environment more predictable so that people are willing to invest in infrastructure that oftentimes takes about 20 years or more to get your returns, 10 to 20 years. So, so it's important to make sure that you create the right kind of environment for the private sector to be willing to invest. And we hope to replicate this pilot center associated with APEC in a number of other economies that are seeking private sector investment. I think, in fact, the Chinese are also very much on board. They've created their own investment bank, but at the same time, they have asked the Australians, for example, to see whether a pilot center can be set up in China as well to attract private sector investment into this, because the amount that is needed is huge. ADB, the Asian Development Bank, predicts about, or estimates about $8 trillion worth of money needs to be put in to develop infrastructure to make sure that the Southeast, especially the Southeast Asian countries, continue to grow. They're now beginning to grow, but one of the major problems is that they lack infrastructure, and that might really push down their growth in the years ahead. The last thing I'll say is, again, there's so many things. The more I work with APEC, the more I realize how much there is there and how little I actually know about all of the things that it actually does. So very broad, broad area, 40 working groups in every area they can think of: food security, health security. So I'm not even discussing those at this point, but I don't want to bore you all to death, for one thing. But the last thing I will say is that we are very focused on, especially the U.S., and the Australians have are co-sponsoring an effort with us to improve cross-border education. And we've talked with a lot of other economies. There's a great deal of support for this, and that is we're trying to, for example, establish a APEC education and training scholarship program where we will hopefully by the end of the year be able to gather all the information we have about all of the educational and training scholarships that are available for students especially from developing APEC economies, to go to school or internships or training in other parts of the APEC region. And so Taiwan, for example, we've talked to China, Japan, Australia. We're all very interested in doing this. And so by the end of the year, what we're hoping to do, in very concrete terms, is to actually establish a website, part of the website of the APEC website, apec.org. And if a student from, let's say, the Philippines wanted to look for a way to go somewhere to study engineering or study whatever he or she wants to study, they can simply go into this website and then download from there a wiki, I guess what they call it, a wiki something or other, but I forget now. But anyway, you go in there and then you'll list there China, U.S., and so on. Under each, you'll see all of the, not all, but a lot of the scholarships that are available for each country. And in our case, for example, I've talked with, I was in Auckland about a couple of weeks ago in New Zealand, attending an ABAC meeting, which is the APEC Business Advisory Council meeting. And I had a chance to talk with a lot of American businesses. And what I suggested to them was if they would be willing to set up scholarships, perhaps, a company like, I spoke to Qualcomm, for example, set up a Qualcomm scholarship and say that if you want to go to study masters in IT somewhere, a computer or something like that, you can go there and Qualcomm will support you and give you, let's say, a year's scholarship to go to a school that you apply to, and or beyond that, perhaps if they need to have, if you'd like to do an internship with a company, Qualcomm could offer 3 or 4 internships, or you can work for Qualcomm for 3 months or half a year to increase your ability to work and to learn how to actually operate in the business environment. So hopefully we'll put all of this together and put it on this website and have people who are looking for some support, financial support especially, to go somewhere, to be able to look at this and then take advantage of it, know where to apply, and therefore increase cross-border education opportunities. So all of these things are being done. We also have wildlife trafficking that we're working on. We have, a whole set of things. But I won't go into details because, again, it'll take a long time. But I think someone tells me that, sometimes I joke with people. As you know, I used to be the DCM in Beijing, and sometimes when I was back in Beijing, my colleagues would ask me, what's the difference between your work now and your work in Beijing? And I would actually say that, what I actually said was that, on this job, in Beijing, I would oftentimes be called in at 3 o'clock in the morning to be given a démarche on some hot issue. But in this job, I'm almost never called in the morning to talk about APEC. So this is more like gardening, it's grooming, it's nurturing, it's building a lot of things. But nobody seems to really want to bother me early in the morning to talk about some issue. So that's the big difference. Okay, I think I've gone on for a little long. So if you would like to start with the Q&As, I'd be glad to respond.
Great. Just a reminder, of course, to wait for the microphones and be sure and give your name and your outlet before you ask your question. For our colleagues in New York, if you have a question, please go to the podium so we can tell that you have one. So, great, yes.
John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Dr. Wang, welcome.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. I'm sure the answers to which you know. First one.
But may not be able to tell you.
All right.
All right. Okay.
That may be true too. While in Ningbo, did you detect any decrease in interest or enthusiasm in APEC because of the fact that there is a final push for the TPP negotiations? Mm-hmm. That's the first question. Second question, are there any issues this year that will be important for Taiwan or involve Taiwan? Either multilaterally or bilaterally between the United States and Taiwan. Thank you.
Yeah, on the first question, it's hard for me to compare, but I felt that, again, in terms of APEC itself, I felt that there was a lot of interest in it. Li Baodong, for example, the vice minister, was there for almost the entire 2 days. And we met with him. I had about over a dozen bilaterals, and we met with Vice Minister Li Baodong as well. And of course, that would suggest a great deal of interest on their part. And apart from that, Zhang Jun, the Director General, was there. And of course, my counterpart, Tan Jian. It was very active. Again, 2 weeks of meetings. Again, all of these different areas. So I don't know that it detracted away. I didn't see any reporters in terms of people coming directly to talk about it with me. So that might be an issue. I don't really know. But I'm trying to think now if there were, in fact. I think there were sort of, there were reporters. In fact, I gave a report that came out in China Daily. If you look at the Saturday issue on investment. And I was also interviewed by CCTV. Over there. I'm not sure if that came out or not, but I think it did because I think one of my my wife's friends said they saw me on television. So yeah, there was report. So it was reported. I just wasn't thinking, but yeah, there was. So on the Chinese part, clearly, I think because it's in China, they really want to make it a really big success. So, and we had a really great gala dinner hosted by Ningbo government and Zhejiang provincial government. So I thought again, that was my first Psalm 1, so I can't compare it to other Psalms before, but I would say that clearly I thought it was done really well and very active. Yeah, on Taiwan, I think, I forget exactly what the question is, if there's any issue.
The microphone.
Are there any issues that are either important to Taiwan or will involve Taiwan, either bilaterally between the United States and Taiwan or multilaterally?
Okay.
Obviously, we all know now that President Ma is not going.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I don't know whether he is or isn't going. It's a matter of fact. I don't. I know there's been some discussion of that. But I don't sense that in this case there'll be anything very different, it seems to me, in terms of Taiwan's participation. Because, in 2001, I think there were a lot of issues that came up when it was hosted in Shanghai. And because that was fairly early on. But by now, since 2001, it's now been 13 years. And every year Taiwan has been involved in a very normal sort of way. And to be fair, I would say that, and to be completely honest, I would say that perhaps our Taiwan colleagues are still a little concerned that something may not be exactly correct. But I think having been through this since 1990s, I think we've pretty much established a pattern in terms of Taiwan's involvement and participation in APEC forums. So I don't expect that there will be any major issues as far as that's concerned. And of course, and a lot of things have happened since 2001, including Ma Yuqi's visit to Nanjing more recently, but the cross-straits, a lot of it has changed dramatically. So I think that also gives me a lot of hope and expectation that everything will be very smooth in China this year. Yes, sir.
Hi, Chen Weihua, China Daily. I want to ask, you earlier talked about China is interested about Asia-Pacific Free Trade Agreement, the future, right? I think they raised this issue. How far is this? It seems that China-US is talking about now BIT. I don't know when it's going to conclude. China is not even part of the TPP. So there's, I don't know, is that some kind of, wouldn't want to say a pipe dream of how far down the road, what is the roadmap if we are talking about this free trade agreement for Asia Pacific?
Okay.
What's the U.S. response to Chinese on this issue? Thank
Sure.
you.
Yeah. First of all, just to make a slight correction, which is an important correction, the FTAP, FTAAP, is not an agreement per se. It could be, I'm not really sure, but the formal term for it is the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific. It's not the Free Trade Agreement of the Asia Pacific. And that's an important distinction because we really don't know exactly what this Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific will be. As you said, we already have TPP, which is in fact an agreement in the sort of normal trade jargon. And we have RCEP, that's also the negotiation of a free trade agreement among other economies that China is part of. So I think, I think at this point, the issue is whether or not we're going down the road of trying to do more free trade agreements, because there are now 75 in the region. So everyone's going down the road. The question now we have is, how do all these agreements, how do they coexist with each other? Is it a problem to have so many agreements? Because ASEAN already has one, then ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN plus 1, ASEAN plus 6, then RCEP, which includes India, and then you have a lot of the bilateral ones, Taiwan, Singapore, New Zealand, China now doing their CKG or CJK or something like that, China, Japan, Korea. So it's not that nothing is happening. It's that too many things are happening in terms of trying to negotiate free trade agreements among all of the regions. So I think the free trade area of the Asia Pacific is, starting off with perhaps a stock take, basically to find out among all of these, first of all, what are they? A lot of people still don't know what TPP is in terms of its final version, and of course that's still being negotiated. And same thing with RCEP. So the idea is maybe this exercise of the FTAP is a way of trying to understand better what all of these different processes, where they're leading, what are they, how do they coexist with each other, and then decide where to move after that to try to arrive at something that's more coherent, maybe, across the board. So I can't say when we're going to reach it, but certainly a lot of movements have already started. And so perhaps after we do the stock take means just the sort of inventory and understanding, then all of us then can better understand how we want to shape the region to try to make it, in fact, more more effective in terms of trade and investment liberalization.
Gentleman here, yeah.
I thank you. Xiaoyang Xia from Wonghui Daily, Shanghai, China.
From where?
Wonghui Daily, Shanghai,
Okay.
China. You mentioned that you've talked a lot of topics during the Psalms. And the question is, what would you foresee or expect will be the most noteworthy progress, achievement to be reached during this APEC, especially from the U.S. perspective view? And secondly, there's been no mention about the BOGO goal. So are you still working on that, or are you still optimistic about the realizing of that BOGO goal? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I really like sports, so let me just use the sports analogy. Your first question about, well, what's the single largest achievement and so on for APEC? It's very difficult to answer that. In other words, you're asking for what is the home run in baseball? Are there going to be home runs and so on? And maybe from the Chinese perspective, it could be because of maybe FTAP is something that they think is very important, that it could be the start of something that's historically very significant. For us, I think we have a lot of goals, and so there's not one single home run that we think everything is based on achievement of this particular goal. We think that energy, environment, women, education, health, food, anti-corruption, all of those things are very important to sustain the growth of the region, and not any single one. So so my answer maybe is that from our perspective, the greatest achievement of APEC would be to be able to make progress in many of these different areas to push it ahead, so that our economies as a whole can continue to grow in a sustainable, clean, and green fashion. And in the long term, that's what's going to be important, whether our growth can continue with infrastructure as well or not. So I don't think it rests on one single thing. And as you know, in baseball, you may hit a few home runs, but you won't necessarily win the game. If you hit 10 doubles and 12 singles, you'll probably win the game, and rather than if you hit 2 home runs. So I think that's our focus. I think it's a very broad-based focus, and not to rush too rapidly, because whenever you do rush too rapidly, oftentimes you find that you come up with problems like air pollution and so on as you're rushing forward to try to achieve that one goal. So I think that's my answer to that. In terms of BOGO goals, I think it was established in '94 before I came on board, of course, and I would say that it's more an idea of free and open trade. So everything we're doing, for example, I talked about trying to open up the services. That's all a movement towards, it's open and free trade. That's the BOGO goal. So everything we're doing in step by step are ways to reach the goals. Whether we've reached it or not is another matter. But establish a direction.
Yes, the BOGO has been delayed.
My throat's bad. I just arrived last night around 11 o'clock from China. But you say it's been delayed. Yeah, I guess it's been delayed, and it depends. And people have questions about what actually BOGO goals is. It's not like a legal contract. It's a set of a vision of moving towards free and open trade. Well, I don't know when the end goal is, when we can actually arrive at completely free and open trade in the region or in the world. So I think it's a work in progress. So I would say that BOGO goals, to me, sets out a direction that we should strive for. Have we reached it or not? You could say no. But have we made progress? Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, there in the back. And I think this will be our last question.
Thank you. My name is Daisuke Igarashi from the Japanese newspaper Asahi Shimbun. I have a question about TPP. So ministers met in Singapore, but they couldn't reach an agreement. So how do you see the latest progress on the TPP? Do you still expect to see kind of agreement anytime soon? And the second question is that, do you think the fact that U.S. government doesn't have TPA is actually affecting like other TPP member countries, and
Sure.
also, and slowing down, negotiations? You think? Thanks.
Sure. I'll answer the second one first. As far as we know, it has not. The lack of a TPA at this point has not affected, from our point of view, in terms of negotiations, progress towards TPP. Or because there are a lot of other issues that are more important in terms of just the actual issues themselves, market access and so on, that are, I think, more key to the concern. The fact that TPA has not yet been done was not expected to begin with until afterwards. In fact, ratification, for example, is going to happen after the TPP is done. So the fact that you don't have guaranteed ratification doesn't mean you cannot move forward on trying to get the agreement, because after all, none of the other 11 members have ratified it either, or can guarantee ratification either. So I think one step at a time is the most important thing. And at this point, we're not seeing any real, no impact. People are driven by the other substantive issues within TPP. And on the TPP itself, I think you've seen the statements already issued by USTR, and of course we've kept essentially abreast of everything that's going on there. I do think clearly from what you can see from the USTR, what they've said, and it's true, I think we've made very significant strides forward on this. But as everybody expected, it's really the most difficult part of the negotiation, the hard part of the negotiation. So yes, we did not complete it. That's very clear. It's also very clear that progress was made. I think significant progress was made. When do you expect it to be finished? It's hard for me to predict, but I think it'll be finished. And of course, once it's finished and we look back, perhaps 10 years from now or 5-10 years from now, we look back, whether it was finished 1 year later, 1 year earlier, several months later or earlier, really is not that important. From the historic perspective, if we do complete it, and I think we're very close to completing a very high-level agreement, I think that if history were to judge it, it would not be the issue of whether or not it was done 1 year earlier or 1 year later in terms of the actual agreement. So our intent clearly is still to complete it this year, and as soon as we can. But again, as we've said oftentimes, we want a good agreement. We don't want just any agreement. We want a good agreement. Earlier we spoke about the fact that there are already 75 agreements out there. So it's not a matter of just doing an agreement. It's a matter of having one that is that's historically important, that actually makes a significant improvement over existing ones. So, well, thank you so much. Appreciate your coming. I hope you guys stayed awake at least.
Thank you. That ends the briefing.
Thank you.